Good morning, everyone. So, today we are going to talk about the Crusades, the holy wars that made hundreds of thousands of European Christian knights make their way to the Holy Land, hoping to conquer it from the local Muslim rulers. We're going to look at the causes and the consequences of the Crusades, and in particular, we'll discuss the following points. So, what are the Crusades? What were the short-term causes, the long-term causes, and finally, the consequences? There is also a model answer in the transcript for today's question, which is, what were the Crusades? A small side note, we are going to look at the Crusades from a European perspective. Of course, the Muslims had a different perspective and a different point of view, which is very interesting to explore and very interesting to see. However, we really don't have time to do that. But still, it will be interesting to start looking at the Crusades from the point of view of our ancestors, of the Western European knights. So let's begin. What are the Crusades? With the word Crusades, we generally mean a series of military expeditions in which medieval European knights try to conquer Palestine, the Holy Land, from its Muslim rulers. Palestine used to be Christian until the 7th century. Remember, we made a lesson on the rise of Islam, but then it had been under Muslim rule for like 300 years, more than 300 years before the Crusades. So people say reconquer, but it was more like a conquest than a reconquest. The Crusades began in the year 1095 when Pope Urban II in the French city of Clermont made a thunderous speech calling to arms all the knights of Christian Europe. Thousands of European knights and men-at-arms answered the call to arms and marched toward the Holy Land. And the First Crusade, which ended in the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, was a resounding, if very bloody and cruel, success. Now, once they had conquered those areas of the Middle East, the Crusaders established a number of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities. It was the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli around here, and the very short-lived County of Edessa around here in the east. These states lasted, changing a lot for 200 years until the year 1291, when the last Crusaders were kicked out of the city of Acre by the Egyptian Mamluks. Acre is here. The Crusades are generally considered to be holy wars, since one of the most characteristic aspects of the Crusades was the promise of the remission of sins for those who participated, meaning that if they took part in a crusade, the church promised them to sort of cancel, erase the sins, allowing them to get into heaven faster. According to Catholic doctrine, if you sinned in your life, then you spend some time in a place called purgatory, where you get purified by your sins. We're not talking about months, we're talking about thousands of years of your afterlife before you're finally admitted into heaven. The remission of sins would remove this waiting time, in a way, if you did things right. And the theology and the doctrinal aspects of it are a bit more complicated, but that's how most people understood it. I go to a crusade, I do a good deed in the name of Christ, and I will go to heaven faster. This is what people understood at the time. Now, consider just how much medieval people really believed in the afterlife. They really believed that the life was not just here and now, but was for eternity. And if you consider that, you will realize how important an incentive this was, this easier way to heaven. Indeed, it was so effective that soon the Crusades turned into the first mass movement of European history. In an age without internet, without newspaper, and without even the printing press, where all pieces of written information were handwritten, everyone from Norway to Portugal, from Scotland to Sicily, knew what the Crusades were, and they wanted to participate. It was really the first huge mass movement of European scale, and it was something huge. Now, what else? What were the short-term causes of the Crusades? Now, we have to ask ourselves the usual two questions historians ask when trying to understand the causes of an event. Why did it happen there? And why did it happen then? Or in other words, why did it happen in Europe after 1095 and not at any other time in any other place? There must be something specific to Europe in that particular period which made the Crusades possible. To do that, we'll need to consider both the short-term causes, so what were the immediate events that lit the fuse, and the long-term causes, so the systemic, the way the European society was arranged in order to, in a way, unlock and make the Crusades possible. The short-term causes are relatively simple in a way, and involve a battle between the medieval Romans, the Byzantines, we made a lesson on them, and the Turks in 1071, the Battle of Manzikert. Deep into the mountains of eastern Anatolia, an army of Seljuk Turks coming from Iran completely destroyed the Roman army led by Emperor Romanus IV, opening up the entire Anatolian peninsula to the Turks, and with time eventually the whole area would become known as Turkey. After this initial battle, the Roman emperors started sending letters to the Western European princes and counts and dukes, asking for soldiers and mercenaries. They were in a desperate military situation. Almost their entire army had been wiped out and they needed new soldiers, so they started calling for mercenaries. They knew that the Western Europeans, the Franks, as they were known, were very warlike, okay, and that the knights were formidable warriors who were also looking forward to be paid in gold, which was abundant in the east but very scarce in Western Europe. So they said, okay, we need soldiers and we have golds. Western Europeans have lots of soldiers but not a lot of gold, so they will answer a call, and they did. However, with time, Pope Urban II started thinking that maybe he could turn this call to arms into something bigger. He realized that if he promised them forgiveness for their sins, the knights would go ahead and maybe conquer Jerusalem, maybe fight for a bigger Christian cause that was not just money and gold. And yes, and also we need to understand that Jerusalem was incredibly important for the Christians and still is. It's the place where Jesus was crucified and resurrected according to the Christian religion. It was, for medieval Christians, the center of the universe, nothing less than the center of the universe. So in 1095, Urban II made a speech in the French city of Clermont, promising that whoever took part in the Crusades would go to heaven, as we said. And just like that, a call to arms for Frankish mercenaries began one of the major turning points in European history. However, as historians, we need to look a bit further. If the Pope was to make a similar speech now, for example, it would not be as powerful, and in fact, I bet that it would make a lot of people rightly angry. This is because, as you can imagine, in the 11th and 12th centuries, medieval society was much different from ours. People believed different things, had a different mentality, saw the world in a different way. And these differences are what made them more receptive to certain suggestions, to certain ideas. The first thing we need to understand is that medieval society was, as we just said, deeply religious, and that religious life was controlled by a single institution, the Catholic Church. It had not always been like this, and the Church had only started to grow as an institution around the year 1000. Before then, yes, it was powerful, but it was not the Church. It was the Church. By the time of the Crusades, so around 1100, 1095-1100, the Catholic Church was by far the most powerful organization in Europe. So we can say that one of the long-term causes of the Crusades was the growing influence of the Church in the life of medieval people. In the 10th century, in the 900s, very few people knew who the priests were. By the 1000s, by the year 1000 and so on, more people were more constantly in contact with their priests and with representatives of the Church who had more authority over them. Another group of people who held a huge amount of influence and power in medieval Europe were the knights. The job of a knight was literally just to fight, okay? In treatises on medieval society, the knights are called those who fight. Their ability to hold a sword and ride a horse, often at the same time, were the reasons why they were respected as people, and the reason why the tenants, the peasants, accepted them as lords. I mean, if they weren't even good as warriors, why would they endure all the terrible conditions of servitude that they were forced to endure? But hey, we're living a terrible life, but at least we are working for the guy who is protecting us. This was the way they taught in many cases. However, we are still very far in the 11th century from the idea of the good knight in shining armor. Okay, that comes later, much later. The Middle Ages have a lot of change in the culture. Before the Crusades, knights were simply rich soldiers. Okay, they liked to fight with their neighbors, and there were thousands of them, and they caused Europe to descend into a state of almost constant war between neighbors. It was only thanks to the influence of the church, of the Christian church, which sort of tamed them, turned them from aggressive warriors who just wanted to fight into virtuous Christian warriors who used their tendency to be violent for what they believed was a good cause. Initially, this meant forcing them to stop fighting on Sundays, which is the only day of the week when you go to church and all that. But later, the church would convince them that going on a crusade rather than killing your neighbor was a better thing to do. That, okay, you want to be violent, you want to fight, why don't you go on a crusade instead of, just killing the guy next to you? And they convinced them that going to the Holy Land was the best thing they could do in both this life and the afterlife. Therefore, we can say that another one of the long-term causes of the Crusades was the importance of knights in European society. Finally, we need to consider that the Muslim world beyond the Mediterranean was no longer seen as a foreign planet. For a while, contacts between the Middle East and Europe were very scarce, were not as frequent. However, throughout the 150 years before the First Crusade, more people started visiting the Middle East. More people went into pilgrimage, into religious trips, religious travels to the Holy Land. And there was a constant intensification of contacts between the two shores of the Mediterranean. As the Latin Europeans traded more closely with the Muslims of the Middle East, they visited the areas more often. They started thinking of it as a real place. It was thanks to these connections that the people in Central and Northern Europe started to feel that Jerusalem was not a place that existed. It's Jerusalem, it's somewhere, and maybe we will never see it. No, they started thinking, okay, it's Jerusalem, it's there in the map. It's a real place. We can go there. We can and should conquer it. So another cause was the intensification of contacts between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean. But what were the consequences of the Crusades? The proper Crusades, and I use proper here in quotation mark because, as many historians know, Crusades don't really have a final date, and people kept calling religious wars crusades for a long time after the end of the Middle Ages. But we can say that these crusades, the ones in the Holy Land, ended around 1291. However, they left a very important legacy to both Europe and the Middle East. The first and most visible legacy is a legacy of mistrust. Unfortunately, the Crusades are mentioned by both Europeans and by Muslims whenever there are tensions or conflicts between Christians and Muslims anywhere in the world. We tend to forget, however, that they were not just religious wars, but they were religious wars that could happen only in that precise moment of the Middle Ages. It is ridiculous to speak of a crusade, to call something that is happening now a crusade, to talk about the Crusades when talking about the wars in the Middle East. They have nothing to do with them. It's just something, a way we try to simplify the present and the past. It's incorrect. This doesn't really stop people from bringing them up whenever they can, even if it is historically and I believe morally wrong to do so, because it causes hostilities, it causes tension, and it means not understanding the past and not understanding the present. However, there were also some more positive results. The culture of the Muslim world at the time was much more sophisticated and advanced than the European culture at the time. There was, for example, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which was this huge library and scientific center where people did research, read and translated ancient texts, and tried to get books from all over the world. It was really a scientific institution. And the Crusades, the fact that people came from the West to the Middle East and came back and learned something, the Crusades allowed some of that culture to reach Europe, leading to the development of literature, art, and science. The Crusades also allowed the European countries, especially the Italian city-states — Italy is like in the middle of the Mediterranean, so it was privileged as a trading area. So these Italian city-states like Genoa or Venice became very, very rich by trading with the East. Because if you are in Germany, France, or Britain, if you want to trade, you want to buy spices or silk from Syria, from Turkey, from Iraq, you can't do that because it's far away and there are no planes or trains. So you need to go through the Italian city-states, which, thanks to the Crusades, became incredibly rich. In the long term, in centuries, this would allow them to develop a very refined culture, which would lead to the Renaissance and to the beginning of modernity in Europe. So, those were the facts for today. I'm looking forward to read what you can write, and I'll see you next time.